Well, good afternoon again, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Christine Nardi. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Nonprofit Excellence, and we want to say a big thank you to all of you who are joining us today from our Charlottesville region, where our home base is, as well as from across the state, and even a couple brave souls from across the country. So we welcome all of you to today's 7 Actionable Principles webinar. While we're getting started, we would love to build community on Zoom. So you'll see some of your webinar participants introducing them in chat, and I encourage you to do that as well. Please put your name and where you're from. I'm really excited to welcome you all. This is the 7th event in our 7 Actionable Principles for a Strong Social Sector Learning series. And if you've joined us for any of the sessions 1 through 7 of the series, we want to welcome you back. And if this is your first, we invite you to check out the series of videos, and we will put a link in the chat. Our dialogue topic today is trust-based philanthropy, and we're so glad to be joined by partner practitioners from a community foundation, a corporate foundation, and nonprofits they work with to hear about how funders and nonprofits are exploring, how they're implementing, and how they're advancing trust-based philanthropy in practice. So, for those of you who are new to the 7 Actionable Principles, what exactly are these principles? C&E's 7 Actionable Principles for a Strong Social Sector Framework and the companion resources are designed for 2 reasons. One is to build capacity within, and also to bridge understanding across nonprofits and funders who are core partners in social impact work. The goal here is to strengthen the social impact sector and to deepen our impact in service community. The webinar today specifically highlights Principle 3, which is growing financial support by building relationships of mutual trust and accountability. And we encourage you to learn more about the 7 Actionable Principles through the links that you'll find in the chat. Speaking of the chat, I'm glad to see that there are a lot of introductions that are rolling in. Welcome again. If you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself, please do as we build our virtual community. We also welcome audience questions using the Q&A function throughout. So ask away throughout the session, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions that come in during the session. And also, we'll have a follow-up email afterwards. The chat will be a very busy resource exchange today, so keep an eye on it as we go. At the end of this session, we'll share what we're calling resources to go to help you on your trust-based philanthropy journey. We'll also share resources, today's slides, and a video in our follow-up email. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that C&E's Charlottesville office is located on the ancestral home of the Monacan Indian Nation. We invite you to learn more, and you'll find a link to the Monacan Nation website and a great documentary also in the chat. And now, I'm really excited to welcome today's guests. Our facilitator today will be Holly Hatcher with the Genan Foundation, and she will be in conversation with John Brothers, a member of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project Steering Committee and president of the Rowe Price Foundation. Then our panel discussion will include John, as well as Brandi Yee, Chief Program Officer with ACT for Alexandria, along with their nonprofit partners. And we're welcoming to the panel today, Moira Fratantuono, Development and Communications Director with Wide Angle Media, and Amanda Hazelwood, Executive Director of the Spitfire Club. Holly and John, welcome to you both, and thank you for getting us started.
Thanks, Christine. Welcome,
Thank
John.
You. Hey.
I am so excited to be facilitating this panel after 20 plus years in this sector. And I was reflecting in preparation for this call about the first time I heard trust-based philanthropy, which was in 2016 when I read a blog post from Voulet with nonprofit Absolutely Fabulous, where he first talked about the impact that the Whitman Institute had on him by practicing trust-based philanthropy principles. That led me to a blog post from Pia Infante with the Whitman Institute. Fast forward to 2020, we have the birth of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. You serve on that steering committee. It's a 5-year initiative. And here it is 2023, and trust-based philanthropy is the new buzzword of the philanthropeak of the sector. So we'd love to do some level setting and start off this call by giving everyone a 101 to make sure everyone understands really what trust-based philanthropy is. You've got some slides. Welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you to educate us. Thanks.
Great, and we'll start with the first slide. First, I want to just thank everybody for being here today and for your commitment to at least learning more about trust-based philanthropy. I very much view this as a movement within the philanthropic and nonprofit sector, a movement that has really caught steam, which is really great. It also presents a number of challenges when you grab momentum and what we're starting to see. And so I'll go over at least what Trust-Based Philanthropy 101 is, and then we'll get into the panel. So I think ultimately trust-based philanthropy tries to address the power dynamics that exist amongst funders and the communities that they aim to support. And so you'll see here kind of a cartoon that kind of talks about the experiences of folks that are on the ground level as they intersect with philanthropy. Often, most nonprofits, if they're entering the space of philanthropy, are dealing with multiple organizations, philanthropic organizations, and will likely come into a variety or a web of responsibilities and structures and systems and things that have been created that are really challenging, that exacerbate the dynamics that exist between philanthropy and the communities that they aim to support. So there's obviously very technical ways that I'll talk through about what trust-based philanthropy sees, but then also some cultural areas that we think are really important to address. So you'll in these comments you'll see 5-page LOIs with a variety of different attachments that are needed, with the timeline of when we'll get back to you, things that they'll fund and not fund, impacts that philanthropy is seeking that are challenging and troublesome, language and a variety of different kind of interpersonal dynamics that create real division between philanthropy and the communities that they have. And so we can go on to the next slide where I think we get more specific. But if we look at the overall trust-based philanthropy project, for us here, at least at Rowe Price, we began our path into, at the time, it wasn't called trust-based philanthropy. We called it the how. Interesting enough, the folks that created trust-based philanthropy before they had the language of trust-based philanthropy also called it the how, but ultimately backs into the idea of the way in which we do our work. And for us at Rowe, we got into this work after the unrest of 2015 here in Baltimore, where we heard time and time again from our community members about the systems and structures that philanthropy had created and the bedside manner, lack of bedside manner that philanthropy had in the many years before the unrest. But overall, trust-based philanthropy project, for which I'm fortunate to serve on the steering committee, is really trying to provide funders and grant makers with tools and frameworks and places where they can converse both online, but in sessions like this, to kind of really think through and create a more equitable and impactful philanthropic sector. At its base level, trust-based philanthropy is rooted in the belief that when funders share power eye to eye at eye level with the nonprofits and communities that they aim to support, it's going to better enable us to address the issues of the world that we're trying to meet day in and day out. So we can go to the next slide there. And so, oftentimes folks associate trust-based philanthropy with just doing these 6 things, which obviously we believe technically that organizations should do these areas. But trust-based philanthropy is not a checklist of, if I've done these, that means I'm trust-based. Trust-based is an ongoing journey that philanthropic organizations are engaging in to try to create trust with the organizations that they aim to support. And so, the first one is funding should be multi-year, unrestricted, right? And so, the idea of giving year-to-year grants is really challenging, both administratively for organizations, but it obviously doesn't beckon a lot of trust to those organizations. For us here at Rowe Price, we, before 2015, had been year in and year out funders. When we looked at it from an administrative standpoint, but also from a strategic standpoint, we found that it didn't make a lot of sense. And then from the way the money went into to our organizations, we realized that there was no data that suggested that program funding was more effective than unrestricted funding. In fact, unrestricted funding, which obviously organizations at the ground level really need, is, for us, for me, I work in an investment firm that makes investments in companies all over the world. When our trustees from the investment firm came in and we said we want to give unrestricted funding, their first reaction is like, well, why would we do that? And the easy response was like, well, you wouldn't give, you wouldn't invest in the same way that you're asking us to invest in nonprofits. And that was definitely true. The second one is do your homework. And that means that the onus on the relationship oftentimes has been grantees submit lots of information, tell us everything about you, and philanthropy kind of comes in not doing any information or coming to the table with any information. And it is really upon philanthropic organizations to really do their homework and find out about the organizations and put as much effort as the organizations are putting in to tell you about themselves, that you should be putting in as much, if not more, information about understanding them and creating platforms and avenues to be able to do that. The third one is simplify and streamline paperwork. There's an old SSIR article, I think it's now 12 years old, but about how philanthropy is drowning in data. Many of the application processes and information that we grab, reports that we grab, are largely dying on the vine. Many philanthropies are not learning organizations. And so it's really important for organizations to be really looking at what information do I really need? And then ultimately, what is the customer experience in terms of organizations as they submit paperwork? Are we asking for things that we're not using? What is the information that we're seeking that actually is really helpful for us, but also is helpful for the organization? The fourth one is being transparent and responsive. Oftentimes, organizations will say that they do not, that oftentimes funders are not transparent, that there seems to be moving kind of goalposts on the ways they make decisions, or that the information is not totally transparent, but that also when they get back, they often get back many, many months later, that there isn't often a better way or a quicker way in which organizations give back. And trust-based philanthropy is both about being ultra transparent about the way in which the work happens, but also being ultra responsive to the community partners that you want to have that is a privilege to partner with. The fifth one is that the way in which you do your work should be driven by the feedback that your community, including your grantees, are giving. And so you should have a number of ways in which you're getting information on the work that you're doing and how you're doing it. And that you, by having good trust with organizations, they're able to give that information back to you without feeling retribution or challenge to being able to do that. And then finally, foundations, whether it's corporate or otherwise, have lots of ways to help nonprofits beyond just traditional cutting a check. There are lots of different ways. Like, one of the powers of philanthropy is that you have the ability to see things from 10,000 feet above. You can help form partnerships and collaborations. You can use your social capital. Sometimes you all can get involved in capacity building and technical assistance. Lots of different ways that you can support organizations beyond the check. And so that's the last one of the technical areas of trust-based philanthropy. We can go to the next slide. But obviously, the ongoing work relates to the dimensions that we call it at Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. These are things that you are doing on an ongoing basis to help facilitate and further trust-based philanthropy principles, and they're largely based in four areas. The first one is, how do people experience, organizations and leaders experience your organization? Obviously, if you're getting feedback and advice and guidance, and you have accountability partners, a variety of other things, you should have a good understanding about how you show up in community and where are the areas where, when you show up in community, you might not be your best self, and what are the things you need to do to be able to do that. What are the ways in which your practices, how you implement the work and the technical work on a day-to-day level, how does that show up in the way in which you do work? Anywhere from your website to the information to how your foundation staff or your program officers or even your board members, how do they show up in community? And what are things that you can do to enhance your practices on an ongoing basis. Your structures, right? Like how have you created your organizational chart or other ways in which that happens, right? Trust-based philanthropy oftentimes is really embraced by the staff, but sometimes not embraced by the board. Well, that is obviously, as a board, is an important part of the structure of an organization. And so trust-based philanthropy means not only that your staff gets it, but that your board gets it, that it's become part of the infrastructure and the structures of the way that you do work. And then finally, leadership, right? The ability to kind of make sure that your leaders are not only propelling trust-based philanthropy thought and guidance, but that you're facilitating it amongst your ecosystem that you have the privilege to be a part of. I think might be the last slide for me, at least. Oh, good. So trust-based philanthropy is obviously, as a movement, growing. Trust-basedphilanthropy.org has a really good website. There's an article that I wrote on, here at Rowe Price, we do a lot of work around trust-based philanthropy and evaluation and kind of the challenging dynamics around evaluation in the trust-based world. And so, but lots of stories from lots of folks, and lots of people joining the listserv, and we're really excited about the momentum that it has. We're also, nervous about it as well, because there's a recent article by our executive director at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project about trust washing, about people using trust-based, but actually not really practicing it, right? And so we're excited about the movement, but we know all movements that are growing also have challenges. But you can go to the website and see all of the different folks that are involved in this really important work. Next slide.
Thanks, John.
Great.
Well,
I think this one just kind of talks about, since trust-based philanthropy has happened, and Holly, I'll let this be the last slide.
Okay.
What we're seeing amongst our network, right, of the hundreds, if not over 1,000 organizations and their leaders. We're starting to see better reporting processes, more unrestricted grants, lots of support beyond the check, lots of different things going on in the sector. And so we're proud of those actions, of course, and we know it's still early stages of our movement. And so we're excited about what's gone on thus far.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited too. It's great to see the momentum, and I appreciate you educating all of us on the principles. So now that we're all kind of have a general sense of trust-based philanthropy, I think the most exciting thing about this panel is that we have nonprofits and funders in conversation together, which was the whole basis of the 7 actual principles for a strong social sector that I was able to partner with the CNE on. And because we know that the sector does not get stronger unless we're in partnership together. And so right now I'd like to first invite John and Moira together to talk a little bit about their trust-based philanthropy journey. And then we'll have Amanda and Brandi in just a second. So Moira, welcome. I'm hoping you can both start off with really quickly about your individual organizations. You have an awesome nonprofit that you work at, and then head into kind of telling us about your relationship together and how that journey began.
So hello, everyone. My name is Moira Fratantuono. I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. This is a really exciting conversation. I work at Wide Angle Youth Media. I am our Development and Communications Director. We're a nonprofit based in Baltimore City. We are the very fortunate sort of recipients of many years of support from the Rowe Price Foundation. We work with young people in Baltimore ages 10 to 24 and use media arts education as sort of a youth development opportunity. So as young people are learning photography and video, graphic design, they're also gaining skills and experiences that are going to help support them in their professional or academic career goals. And so we think about ourselves as arts education, but also workforce and youth empowerment. So there's really a lot here that I think is really rich and really connects with our mission, our values, and how we think about the work. And so I'll turn it over to John in case there's anything else you want to say before we dive into specific questions.
No, I think the interesting thing that Moira said, and you can imagine in your own communities, is Wide Angle Youth Media could be defined as an arts organization. And so for a certain branch of funders, they might say, we don't do that, right? Or youth development. I mean, I'm sure for Moira, this is an ongoing challenge amongst funders, is the definition. And for us, what we care at the end of the day is that Wide Angle Youth Media is connected and rooted in community, and that is expanding communities to better places. And so I remember meeting with Susan Malone, who is the executive at Wide Angle Youth Media early on. And, for us, at least as a corporation, we have the ability to provide, cities like Baltimore, but also places, I was looking at the people saying where they're from. All of the places that you all represent are cities and communities that struggle with infrastructure. And that's what companies have in abundance. And so if you think about an organization that does arts and uses it needs a variety of infrastructure, that's what T. Rowe can provide. And so when we met with Sue, she said, well, I remember this conversation in her office, like, well, what impact do you want from us? And I said, well, what impact do you want? Like, you're the expert on the ground. Like, don't give us that power. You are the expert. Our job is to support you and to figure out what's the best way to do that. And then, is that financial? Is that social capital? Is that infrastructure? Is that connecting you to our associates? We have 7 levers to be able to help them. They've used all of them. And I think to them specifically, all of them are equal. Yes, they love to get a grant. They also love that we connect them to other funders. They also love that we provide capacity building and technical assistance. We, in many respects, provide their professional development for their team, right? So just all those different ways are all rooted in the way in which you can think about what can a philanthropist or what can a company provide at the local level goes way beyond philanthropy. And I think the partnership between our 2 organizations, we view it as a blessing. I don't think Sue or Moira or anybody feels any challenge to say, hey, we like this, we don't like this. They feel total trust in us to be able to be totally honest with us. And they reach out to us all the time, and we reach out to them for feedback and advice. So I think it's one of those things now where that dynamic that Moira's probably sees in her relationships to other funders doesn't exist with us.
Yeah, and I think to kind of expound upon that a little bit, when we think about trust-based philanthropy in principle, what comes to mind for me in my experience with working with T. Rowe Price is really thinking about collaboration, transparency, partnership, listening, mutual learning. I learn a ton from John and from the members of his team, and there's also opportunity where I know they're learning from us too. And we've had those conversations, and that has been really rich. And I think that reciprocity has been really transformative. I know we'll have specific questions coming down the line, but when I think about this in practice, I got into the development world. I was for many years working in our programming, and I got into development in part because I was really curious about how social justice and movements towards social justice could be reflected within development and philanthropy, understanding that there's immense historic challenge there and tension there, and that there's very frequently that vertical top down that John mentioned earlier, where you've got the funder, the nonprofit, and then the community that is being engaged. And what I have seen in our experiences with T. Rowe Price and some of our other funders, there's only a couple who have really, I think, jumped into something resembling a trust-based philanthropy model. But I've seen such a shift, and I think it can be really transformative. And it really has been in my role at Wide Angle, and the way that we think about how we can engage the community that we're serving, that we're connected to. And so instead of this linear top down, I think, or vertical top down, I think it's more linear, and sometimes it's mobile. And I think John and his team have been able to have more sort of strengthened relationships directly with the communities. And so we are not gatekeepers to the community. And so I think it really starts to shift how we think about the really complex needs. If we're talking about real social justice and we're talking about real movement, it takes time. It is complicated. We need complex, dynamic, responsive approaches. And so I think that the old way of doing things, or the common way of doing things, doesn't really lend itself to that.
So you both mentioned practice, and I thought maybe you could give a bit more specifics about what that looks like, how, Moira, from your perspective, how that's different from funders who maybe don't practice trust-based philanthropy or more traditional philanthropy. And John, maybe some of the conversations you've had both internally to bring your own organization along, but try to give some specifics about what it looks like in practice. That would be great.
Sure. So I think John mentioned some of the, we know what trust-based philanthropy isn't. It isn't extensive narrative requests. It isn't having to do hours and hours of data entry for a specific report that may or may not be used for something. It's not extensive reporting on small grants or using sort of, I think a big one for us at Wide Angle, amplifying youth voice is really central to what we do. It's embedded in our mission. And I think that frequently these practices can push for tokenism of students or whatever that community is. For us, it would be our students, or being performative on demand, things like that. And that's not what trust-based philanthropy is. But those are tensions that I and Sue, as our executive director, that we do have to navigate from some of our other funders. And in contrast, when I think of what it means to work with John and his team, there's very much an open conversation. So for example, if we are applying for either general operating funding, or right now, like we are in the middle of a capital campaign. So there's real conversations with John and his team about, this is what we're doing. This is how we see that it may align to your interests. You know, what's appropriate as an ask? What concerns do you have? And so how can you also help us think about how to do this work better, right? They're really open with us on those conversations. And that not only strengthens our request to the foundation, it fundamentally shifts how we do the work. So things like streamlined reporting, John and his team will say in applications, you know, if you've got another application that's similar to our funding area, just send us that. You don't have to write us a whole new application. We have these very specific couple of questions we want to hear your feedback on. But we have for context, we have a grants portfolio of 50 to 60 open grants per year. I cannot imagine what I could accomplish with that free time if the majority of our grants had that same approach. If I didn't have to spend 8 to 10 to 15 hours pulling data for some of the grants that we have, it really fundamentally changes how you can delegate and use your resources. I think another huge thing, and John touched upon this, is professional development. Excuse me 1 minute. I have a scratchy throat today. And so he and his team have talked to, as he mentioned, talked to our executive director, Sue, but also other folks on our staff to find out what's actually going to help us do the work better. And they have provided just absolutely phenomenal resources. So using their financial resources to hire real experts who talk about communications, marketing strategies, how we think about DEI within communications. I mean, our communications approaches externally have been fundamentally changed by the professional development that we have done. They did a donor audit for us, again, using their resources to bring in someone to look at 5 years of trends within our individual donor base to help us understand the actual trends of what's happening. And that has now become an underpinning for my work in development and how we're growing our donor program. So it's, excuse me, by thinking about those strategies and what they have access to as an institution, and then sharing those back with us. Yes, there's making a grant to us, but by helping to reshape how we do the work, that opens up so many more doors. And so I don't want to hog the mic because there's so many more examples I have, and I'm happy to share them as we continue talking, but I want to turn it over to John and then perhaps some other panelists to share.
Yeah, I'll just be super simple, Holly. I think for us in 2015, after, we sat in the basements of churches and community centers and libraries, and sometimes the residence of folks, listening to kind of what they were talking about. And ultimately they said, you got to change the way in which you do your work. And so, like a mystery shopper, we had community members anonymously go through what the experience was like in working with us. And and I think this is true for all philanthropy. You would never design your philanthropy if it was built on the concept of trust-based principles the way you have it today. Everything from the language you use in your applications, whether it's tell me about community need is a good example. No one in community defines themselves that way, but philanthropy does, right? Or program evaluation as compared to organizational health. Like when we look at wide angle youth media, we only care about outcomes in as much as they care about outcomes. What we care about mostly is their health, their wellness. And that's why we focus on that, right? And so from top to bottom, having folks, accountability partners, look at the way you do your work and say, this is the way this feels to me. Just on your general application, the way you ask questions, how does that look to people on the community side? And I would say that more times than not, the questions you're asking, the information that you're seeking is troublesome. That information belongs to community, and you need to hold that information sacredly. And when you ask questions or do it in a way, that often philanthropy does, it breaks trust, right? If I walked in your house and asked you to step on a scale and then say, I don't like the way how much you weigh, you tell me to get the heck out of your house. And oftentimes that's what philanthropy is doing at the local level. So I think really doing a bedside manner audit of how you show up in local communities is the first step to doing this work well. And it's how we started and was super helpful.
Thank you, John. Thanks to both of you. I'm going to bring in Brandi and Amanda for a couple minutes, and then we'll bring all four of you back to be in dialogue with each other before we open it up to question and answer. So there's a lot of great commentary in the chat. Please keep the questions coming, and I promise we'll get to them. So Brandi and Amanda, welcome, and thank you so much for lending your time and expertise to this conversation. I'd love for you both to start with a brief introduction about your work, and then how you have been in partnership with each other in your own journey on trust-based philanthropy. Amanda, let's start with you.
Oh, okay. Hi, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a great conversation. I'm Amanda Hazelwood, and I'm the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called the Spitfire Club. Spitfire is a girls' empowerment reading program based in Alexandria, Virginia, and we're operating in the DC metropolitan area.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Brandi Yee. I'm the Chief Program Officer at ACT for Alexandria, which is a community foundation. And I am thrilled to be here with Amanda and can't wait to dive into conversation together. But just to give you a brief kind of overview of our organization, our mission is to amplify the work of our community by bringing people and resources together. We are about to celebrate our 20th anniversary next year. And to give you an idea, thanks Amanda, about just the size of our organization, we have about $21 million in assets. We don't have an endowment, so our grant making is relatively small. Just program-wise, we have a 2.5 FTEs and a total staff of 6. So I would say the majority of our grant making happens through our donor advised funds, which I can talk a little bit later about how we have the opportunity to help educate donor advised fund holders about trust-based principles. But recently, with money that we received from the city government through the CARES Act and American Rescue Plan Act for pandemic relief, we were able to award nearly $6 million a year. But I would say on a typical year pre-COVID, we are more like $100,000 to $125,000 grant maker. So we are small but mighty, and I would say we are mighty because we have partners like groups like the Spitfire Club.
Great. So can you talk about a little bit more kind of where John and Moira went to about what it looks like in principle and in practice?
Sure, I can jump in first. So I would say that this trust-based philanthropy is really an approach that addresses the inherent power imbalances that exist between funders, nonprofits, and the communities that we serve. And so I would say it's about redistributing power to create a more equitable social sector ecosystem. And I'm really glad that John mentioned that trust-based philanthropy isn't a checklist. It really is an ongoing journey that we need to approach with humility and a learning mindset. And I also appreciate how Moira said that we are all working in really complex spaces with the work that we do, and how it takes time. I think that's something that's going to come out in a lot of the conversation, as well as different practices like a trust-based approach to really help address these challenges. Just to give you a little background on how we came to this work, I first learned about trust-based philanthropy from our CEO. Sometimes it takes new leadership coming to an organization to help you think about things a little bit differently. Our CEO, Heather, came from Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, and she really was a champion of grantee-centric grant-making practices and really believing that nonprofit leaders know what's best for their organizations. I think we probably thought that, but our practices did not reflect what we thought. And so she really encouraged us to think about, how do we center grantee experiences in every step of our process, while being mindful and approaching our role from that place of humility and learning. So I would say pre-trust-based philanthropy, we really prided ourselves on being kind of neutral in the community. And we were really challenged to think about how we use our kind of social and relational capital to take a stand on things and to make an impact on things that matter in the community. And so while we were kind of talking about trust-based philanthropy, we were also having conversations about race, racism, and racial equity in our community. And so trust-based philanthropy really just made sense for our organization because we wanted to make sure that equity was infused in all areas of our work. So I cringe when I think about some of the things that we used to say or do in our grant making. We had a lot of checks and balances in place for nonprofits. We had something where we would give people half the money up front, and then the second half they would get once we got a midterm report. And then we did not pay in the beginning for general admin, administrative costs. And our committee often questioned why a nonprofit might be asking for something, even though they said they needed it, or thought that maybe they could get something done pro bono, or if the organization had reserves, why did they need our help? And so for us, like a simple way that we started was by just removing the final report requirement in 2018. That was kind of our first step into this simplifying and streamlining paperwork, but really instead invited grantees in for a conversation about the grant and lessons learned. Again, it's really that focus on learning is what we really wanted to see, and really put it back to the nonprofit to help us how can we best support them? And then I'll just give you really quickly, like we did overhaul our process in 2019, and that's when Amanda actually applied for her first grant with ACT. And for us, it was publicly naming the trust-based approach. So this was a new way that we were approaching our grant making. And so we wanted to make sure that we were getting the word out to our nonprofit partners, to our donors, sharing resources from the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, but also other blog articles and resources from other foundations about their experience. And we really just named and acknowledged the power imbalance that can exist between a funder and a nonprofit and how we wanted to change that. So we kind of let our stakeholders know that we were adopting this new approach, let them know. We always talk in pilots about how we try things because we want to kind of pilot, test, iterate, and just keep on learning. And so give people the opportunity in the space to ask questions, raise any concerns that they might have, and give us feedback so that we would know how we were doing and just kind of keep it that open conversation. So Amanda, I can turn it over to you and you can talk about what that experience has been for you.
Yeah, I would completely agree about this problem solving learning. Like these are the words that keep coming up for a reason. I think I think of trust-based philanthropy as two partners with different strengths and assets coming together to solve a common problem. And so Brandi mentioned the 2019 cycle. Spitfire is a fairly new organization. It was brand new at the time. And that grant from ACT was my first experience with trust-based philanthropy. So this is just a silly story. I'll never forget getting ready for that meeting. And it felt like it was the most important meeting of my life. And like I got our board chair to come and, it was very exciting. And I walk into the door of that boardroom and Brady's like, well, you got the grant. Yay. I was like, oh, okay, this is a different meeting. And then we got to spend the rest of the meeting. They gave us advice on our project. They picked our brains. They kind of noticed some things. Like, are you sure you just want to talk to that one person? You don't want to talk to more consultants? And our project was better because of it. Whereas if that had been a vetting conversation, I'm not sure we would have been able to go there, So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, Amanda, I'm so glad you said that in the sense that gosh, when I invite people to conversation, I should probably tell them the good news before they have to prepare and come in because I feel like it makes me so sad to think about the stress that you probably went through. And I feel like I know that on the other side too, because not only are we a grant maker, but we also are a grant seeker, right? And so we feel that same thing when we go and prep all this stuff for a meeting with a funder. And so to know that they were taking an approach. So I feel like I'm learning all the time. So that's super helpful.
Well, but I think that also kind of set the stage. I mean, you were a key interview in our strategic planning process, and you were able to come to that meeting and tell us things you're learning. And, we're existing in the same community. We're trying to solve similar challenges. ACT for Alexandria is a hub of so much information that, and I think they do a really fantastic job of getting that out to the community through professional development, through holding forums, just all of the different ways that you are bringing the community together and filling gaps that nobody else is really able to fill. You're uniquely doing that. And so I'm really grateful for this for this 4-year cycle of learning together and just picking each other's brains. And it's been really fantastic for our organization. So
awesome. Thanks to you both. I want to bring back John and Moira too, and then open it up for the 4 of you. I have a couple of questions, and then I'm sure you might have thoughts and questions for each other. All of this has so far been amazing and great, and I can see in the chat people are very much resonating with the way that you all are thinking about and approaching philanthropy in a different way. I know it's not always easy. We're humans, and it can get challenging sometimes. So I thought maybe each of you could spend a couple of seconds, just it may not be with each other, but maybe with a board member or your entire board or with another funder, but talk about maybe when it hasn't been as easy to adopt or kind of move into this practice. And I will, let's start with Moira.
Did you pick me because I was smiling? I was thinking, as long as she doesn't pick me. So I have a couple thoughts on this. I think, as we've noted already, change takes time, right? And it's a big shift. It's a big shift for everyone. And so just recently I have experienced this. Again, trust-based philanthropy work we've done with T. Rowe and others has really made us think critically about how we do a lot of different things. And so one specific that I can give is around how we conduct site visits, how we think about welcoming people into our space in a way that's non-disruptive to our programming team, in a way that does not feel inauthentic or exploitive to the young people in our classrooms, and also naming that there's always still going to be some kind of power hierarchy at place. And so even though we've made a lot of changes over time, and specifically since 2015, because while that was like a critical moment for philanthropy in Baltimore, it was for the folks working in the nonprofit sector as well. And so we've made really intentional shifts from 2015 and ongoing. And so we have new staff who still, they may be artists, but they're not necessarily seeking to be nonprofit professionals. And so they have seen other places or experienced firsthand as, participants in other programs when they were younger, where these things were done in a way that caused harm. And so they have a lot of critical questions for us, or a lot of assumptions made about how and why we do things. And so there's the sort of managing up and communicating up to our board members, but there's also the bringing our staff into, hey, we're trying to do the work differently. These are ways that we've pushed back in the past. These are things that have happened in the past. This is feedback that we've gotten from the community or from other former staff members. And this is how we do it now. This is what informs that. And so I think that goes back to a lot of the same values that we're talking about around trust-based philanthropy, but just understanding that, especially when harm has been done in the past, or when people have had experience with other forms of philanthropy, that we have to clarify to the folks that we work with every day, that's not what's happening here. Or maybe there's a conversation we need to have because maybe I've got a blind spot and there is something that's not working the right way, and we've got to adjust or continue to adjust. And so I think that's something it's been on my mind this week. So it's very relevant currently. So I'll pass the mic over to someone else.
Moira, you made me think about the big check photo in your comment, the big check photo. We've all been there, and how sort of exploitative that is, or it can be. And I just think, how do you explain that to your community? Like, this is what the donor wants us to do. I've said no to a big check photo before because I was just like, nope, unless you're actually putting any of that funding in their pocket, I'm sorry, we're not going to go there. Yeah. I loved the trust washing concept. I was new to it as of this week, but I had an experience once where I think a foundation thought that they were adopting a trust-based philosophy, but they didn't put any emphasis on relationship building. And so we were very fortunate to get a grant. It was restricted, but the reporting requirements were pretty light. And so, there's, it's really helpful for use of time, but they had decided these are the 3 things we really want, and everything else, save your time, do the work. But we didn't have a relationship with anyone at the foundation. And so when we learned something was going to be a little tricky, I had no one to call. I just think we both lost out on a lot of learning in that relationship. And so I think all philanthropy, all fundraising is relationship based, but this one couldn't be trust based because there was no relationship.
John, can you talk about, trust washing? Because you recently wrote about that.
Yeah. So the quick thing I would say about trust washing is it's actually has similarities to a lot of, a worker, you can have kinship to the idea of racial equity, and folks that have said, okay, well, I've gone through racial equity training, therefore I have an equity lens. And the idea of using racial equity, we've seen that word become jargonized, but we've seen the challenges of structural racism still at play, even by folks that are claiming and putting a badge on themselves that they are doing, that they've gone through racial equity training and are practicing those principles, when we know that that's not happening. Some of the same kind of features are happening in trust-based work, right? And it often is very similar to the checkbox nature that largely folks say, well, I'm doing all 6, so therefore I am that. And that is a real challenge. Or, hey, we're our grantees trust us. I know they trust us because they tell us they trust us. I mean, if I'm giving you $100, you're likely to tell me to my face that you trust me. It's just, it's so there's a lot of trust washing. I think, Holly, to the earlier question, I think the first thing I think is really important, and Moira brought this up, is, I've used trust-based philanthropy as a counter movement to strategic philanthropy. And strategic philanthropy was this concept that came in the early 2000s about measuring and scale and like watching organizations and implementing a lot of process on them as a way to watch them and empower them. And in the 20 years or so that strategic philanthropy has been happening, philanthropy at the local level, in the name of strategic philanthropy, has instituted a lot of damage. And so if you were part of that, I cannot walk into Wide Angle Youth Media and just say, give me a hug and let's be friends, and I hope that you trust me, right? Like in Minneapolis, and after the murder of George Floyd, we had 20 Minneapolis-based companies approach Rowe Price and said, hey, we heard about the way you've built authentic relationships in community. We want to do the same. And we were like, that's cool. You can't buy that. And what those folks on 38th in Chicago and Minneapolis are saying is, not only are they mad that they've lost their brother, their friend in George Floyd, they're mad at the systems and structures that were created that you as a philanthropy had a part in. And so you cannot walk in someone's home, kick a hole in their TV and spray paint on their wall and then say, let's be friends. Part of, and Brandi brought this up, is if you care about trust-based philanthropy and this is something you want to do, you have to acknowledge that you've embraced this and that your prior history has done damage in community, and that you're trying to carve a new path out that's ultimately, from our perspective, is led by the self-determinations of local community. That is a dramatic cultural shift in which, one, you have to talk about the challenges that you have taken a part in, and two, change the DNA by which you approach community life, which is to be led. Nobody in any community anywhere in America is saying, I can't wait for a philanthropy to tell me what to do. Right? Moira and Amanda are the experts on the ground in what they do. They lead us, and philanthropy has to be better at that, as compared to them thinking because they have some financial authority or agency that gives them the authority to lead at the local level, which it doesn't.
Yes, thank you so much. And we're getting lots of great feedback to your comment, like so good. And but the hard part is in the how, right? So I'd love to ask Amanda and Moira, like, how do you have these conversations with other funders? And how do you get started? I mean, I think you've all mentioned that this is nuanced and iterative work. So I know for myself and maybe some others on the call, it's like, but it's the getting started part, it's the moving the board along, or the other funders along, that can often be the challenge. And so open it up to all four of you, but start with Amanda and Moira. So maybe Amanda, you go first and just tell us what that looks like when you try to kind of spread this trust-based philanthropy, great relationship you have with Brandi, to the other funders that you interact with.
Well, I have to give Brandi some props. I would say Brandi and Act for Alexandria is actually doing that. We have several trust-based, I'm very fortunate to have several trust-based relationships that I think were inspired by ACT's work because of their work with donor advised funds. And so I would say several of my trust-based relationships have happened. I don't know that the donor showed up to that meeting and said, you know what, we're going to have a trust-based relationship. I think there's a spectrum of trust-based, right? And I've saying, no, that's not going to work for us. We don't have the staff capacity. I love your idea. This is what I love about it. This is what I think we could bring to it, but no, we can't actually do that. And then the donor says, okay, what's the barrier? And so we're able to have an authentic conversation where everybody's sharing, you know, I'm sharing that we don't have the staff capacity. We want to, but we just don't. And then that turns into a gift that was not the donor's intent. The donor wanted to partner on something that was completely different, but the donor ultimately wanted the same outcome that we want because we were ideologically aligned. I also want to say that I am a white woman running an organization that largely serves Black and brown girls, overwhelmingly serves Black and brown girls. And I do benefit from a certain amount of systemic, I would say, trust that I have a long career in nonprofit management. I was able to bring those skills to bear in building my organization. And so I would like to highlight that in trust-based relationships, donors should consider whether they are bringing the ability to trust people who don't necessarily look like them, or, you know, behave in the kind of stereotypical nonprofit way. I think Moira was talking about her team and how they all bring different experiences to the table. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I think I love those points. And I think naming and owning whatever your background is a critical component of trust-based work. And so that's something, again, our executive director is also a white woman leading an organization that works predominantly with Black communities in Baltimore City. And there are a lot of different hierarchies and just histories that come with that it's really important to acknowledge. And of course, I think we all know that this is reflective of a national trend. So it's important to name and name frequently. And so when I think about ways, as I'd mentioned earlier, one of the things that Rowe Price did within the capacity building was connecting Wide Angle and other organizations with an organization in Philadelphia called Big Duck. And so going through a communications training with them really helped us understand how to rethink the language that we were using, and also how to define it collectively. Because within our organization, and also when we speak with folks outside of our organization, there are a lot of words that we use, the way that we think about what is youth development, what is equity, what is just the way that we achieve components of our mission and our values. And in going through this kind of year-long process of sharing the language or defining the language that we collectively use, we created a tool for ourselves. And so now when we think about communicating with donors or potential funders who maybe are not mission aligned or who maybe are not coming to the work with maybe such an equity focused lens or with a progressive lens, we now have concrete tools to say, hey, this is not a word that is an assets-based way of framing the work that we do. You might want to think about this. Because we have this kind of relationship modeled through our relationship with T. Rowe Price, we now can go to other funders and say, hey, something for you to think about. We're an organization that's been around for over 20 years. We have a certain set of resources and staffing capacity. But if you really want to make change and you want to be accessible to newer or smaller organizations, this is hard for us. It's going to be very difficult for those folks that you say you want to engage. And so I think kind of framing it back a little bit, we've gained that sort of self-confidence in our voice. And I think a greater understanding of, as a more seasoned organization, the power that we hold and the ways that we can also start to, in my mind, when I think about it, it's like a ripple effect, right? And so as it continues to grow out, then that conversation with that funder or that point that I've made to someone else then can also have its own ripple effect. And so there are these small ways that we start to see it also shifting. And so that's something that, yeah, again, has just been really helpful as we've moved through, but it's not always easy. And there are times that we've said, like Amanda said, this isn't the right fit for us. You're not aligned to who we are. You're not aligned to how we think about the work. And it's not appropriate for us to have a partnership with you. So I'll turn it over to Brandi or John, but those are some things that come to mind.
The only thing I would say is, and I think Moira brought up a really good point, funders don't like it when other funders tell them what to do, right? The best way to get a funder to shift and change their DNA is by folks like Moira saying, you should look at what T. Rowe Price is doing, right? And so we really do think, and this just tailors up to the idea that as a movement, this has to be a movement of organizations led by folks on the ground, that ultimately, if it is a place where Brandi and I are going to conferences and talking about high-minded ideas behind trust-based philanthropy, this will never work. It will look good on paper. Listen, if every conference has collaboration and partnership, if that was a drinking game, we'd be drunk by now, right? Like we love our jargon and we love our words. But ultimately, if this is a true movement, it has to be led by Amanda and Moira. And they have to be talking about it as the way in which they want to interact with other partners in the community, like funders. And for us as funders, we got to be led by that. If we're leading it, we will ultimately over time co-opt it to something that doesn't look like how it should be. And so I just think Moira's point about her telling other funders shouldn't be taken lightly. That's the way this movement's going to work. And I think Moira feels safe now saying, hey, look at what this group of folks, T. Rowe and others, are doing. And by the way, your processes are really kind of pushing your thumb in our side in a really negative way. This is the best way in which this movement's going to move forward.
Yeah, John, Brandi, before you jump in, I just want to acknowledge too that that's also difficult because of the power dynamics, right? When nonprofits, particularly smaller, less resource nonprofits, don't have a lot of funding resources, right? And so it's really incumbent upon funders, and I know you know this, but just for all the other funders out there, about the importance of doing our work, and that it comes with great responsibility that we enter into this trust-based philanthropy work and movement, and always taking into consideration the power dynamics that exist between funders and nonprofits. Brandi, do you want to say anything, and then we'll open it up to Q&A?
Yeah, I will just say I agree with all those points, and I will still work on trying to communicate with our fellow foundations about the importance of trust-based, because I do feel like we have those relationships with our fellow colleagues at the different foundations. And so like it was helpful to like kind of talk through our approach with other funders and get their questions and whatever their objections were so that we could kind of help address them. And so it's good practice in a sense for us to continue to build the case and figure out what are the things that are holding people back from adopting these types of policies, and how do we meet those objections with the truth of what actual trust-based is and the benefits. For if we talk about wanting to center nonprofits and making sure that we're listening to what our nonprofits need, then again, it just makes sense. But yeah, I would say part of it is also just the humility of realizing we're not always going to get it right, and that we're learning throughout the whole process. I would say one challenge that we've experienced, and I don't know if other funders have felt this, but we get government funding. And when we get that back out to the community, it is not trust-based in the fact that there are so many checks and balances that go into it. And so I think that for us, that was a challenge because we were just adopting these principles, and then COVID happened, and now we're getting this funding that is so much more restricted. And so I would say we would not have been able to do that rapid response grant making had we not had trust-based approach before COVID. But then I also think our responsibility as funders who adopt these principles is to try to push where we can, and have conversations with funders. Like, we're never going to be able to change everything about government grant making, but if we can encourage a conversation about, like, okay, what data do we really need? Why are we collecting it? Can we shift and do things? I mean, I don't want to do things that are illegal, but like, where are ways we can push our friends at the city government or at people who have a little bit more stricter policies, and always continuing the dialogue of, just continuing the movement.
Well, the one thing I would just add, it's Brandi's such a good point on the public side. Listen, philanthropy is 18% of the safety net. Government is nearing 70%. Government often acts as if like their hands are tied on certain areas. So like, for example, in Baltimore, we have definitely pushed government to say, you know, they give overhead rates to engineering and architecture firms that are 80%. That's unheard of in the nonprofit sector. And why does that exist for us and not the others? Sometimes it's purely arbitrary. And there's this thing of like, we've got to watch nonprofits more than we've got to watch engineering and architecture firms or whatever kind of industry is there. So there's that, but then there's also the intermediaries that are organized on behalf of nonprofits or philanthropy are not that strong. And so when you have a statewide nonprofit association, and I'm not saying ours, but you have nonprofit intermediaries, they're the ones that should be fighting for these things. Or on the philanthropic side, if you have a countryside of philanthropy that are practicing challenging behaviors, it's up to those networks to do those types of things. And so I saw one question in the chat, Holly, trying to make a transition for you, that was asking about, like, what do we do with a funder to help this move forward? You pay memberships to networks that should be advocating on your behalf. And you have folks like Brandi and others who are part of philanthropic networks. Our job within those networks is to push those networks to do things. Sometimes those networks are way too comfortable. What I would say lastly is the industry of people that are supposed to help philanthropy and nonprofits actually are the ones that do the most damage. So software systems or evaluators or all of these things that we use to help our work often double and triple down on words like impact and evaluate or scale or some of these challenging things that exacerbate power dynamics. And it's up to us in having our industries and our networks really press their thumb into the side of bad actors in our industry that are exacerbating these challenges.
Awesome. Thanks, John. And you're right. It is time to move to questions and answers from the audience. So thank you to all four of you for just being so candid and vulnerable and taking the time to share your expertise. One question we got was, it sounds like this is a heavily relationship-based model. Yes, it is. So just hearing a little bit about how the relationships for you originated, and then Amanda, more maybe there's a couple other relationships you want to share as well. But how can nonprofits begin a conversation with grantors in trust-based philanthropy is what we're hoping to get at with this. Whichever of you wants to jump in.
So Brandi used the word pilot earlier, and I feel like our organization has been one big pilot project so far. And I think that that has kind of attracted specific types of donors to us. And I think a lot of it is serendipity. A lot of it is just being out in the community. A lot of it is privilege. But when we do find ourselves in a relationship with a new donor, it gives us the opportunity to, from the beginning, establish a culture between us of how we want to operate. And so, for example, we're very fortunate to be newly funded by a family foundation. And the family foundation is figuring out how they want to operate. And we are a guinea pig for them on what elements of trust-based will work and which ones won't, taking into consideration the different, interests, desires, needs of the members of the family. And so we're able to communicate openly about what we can and can't provide. They're able to ask us candidly for what they need, and it's just much more of a dialogue.
The only thing I would say is, I think the act of locking arms with another to change community life should be relational. Philanthropy should not be transactional, right? And if your transaction is merely exists in paper form and then, your review, these things matter at the local level, right? No one needs a philanthropy to tell you what is happening at the community level. And when you want to enter, for us, my team knows that when they enter community life, that's sacred ground, that we have been invited to a community and we have to hold into their home, and we have to hold that in high regard. If you're in a philanthropy that's transactional, you're likely doing philanthropy. Your philanthropy is challenged. And I think for the nonprofit side, like folks like Amanda and Moira, you are the gatekeepers to community. And what that means is that when you have a responsibility in front of funders to say that you're going to represent that community in a certain way, and that means this, this, and this. We had a person come in highly regarded in Baltimore. Moira, you would know this name, I won't say it, came to us then the first time that I had met with her, and she brought all these charts and graphs. And she felt, because I work for a global financial services firm, that that's how I would view and value her, is by the charts and graphs. Shame on us for creating an industry that believes that that's how somebody and their organization is valued. And so I think for us, it's upon organizations to walk in and say, this is the beat that we're walking because I've earned that right to say that. And it is up to philanthropy to say, to trust that and to walk to that beat. But if it's transactional, you're probably doing it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think Amanda and John hit on two such good points. From the nonprofit side, I think, again, if you have relationships that you feel are trust-based, then starting there. If you're talking about trying to find additional new folks who might be invested in and excited about the work that you do that could be welcomed as a potential partner, and that's who you're searching for, then ask them who else they may know, who could be a good fit. So start with those relationships, kind of like we do with so many other things. Start there, because you're going to be on the same page. You already know that you've got some value alignment there. So if John is going to introduce me to someone, I already know he's vetting for them, right? Like I know he's got our back and he understands, he gets it. And so I think that that's part of it. But I think very much having a conversation, building relationships across the board, whether you're working in community and it's our staff who are working with young people in our classrooms, or it's us talking to potential employers for our apprentices when they're going out into their next step. And then I think there's also that conversation. We've sent young people out for externships and they've come back and said, this was not a great experience. I experienced microaggressions. This was not a space that actually was welcoming to me. And so what do we do with that, right? So I think for our community, how then do we say, okay, we hear this is a need, we hear this is a gap. And when we're talking about your success and we're talking about, John, you had like a couple key words there, like being a gatekeeper. What does that mean? What are we gatekeepers for? And how do we fit into this larger ecosystem, this larger picture? Being really aware of that. And again, leveraging that power that you do have to speak up, or to confront in a diplomatic way or with the right resources when things are out of alignment, I think is really, really critical. And only by sort of having the courage to lean into those challenging conversations or where you feel that tension are you actually going to make progress. And it's not always going to be easy, and it's not going to be perfect. And that was another thing that I kind of had in my notes. Don't let this fear of not doing it perfectly hold you back from not trying, because, you know, like I've got 2 young kids. They didn't just learn to walk without making a lot of mistakes. We learn from our mistakes, we make them right, we course correct, and that's how we do better. And so I think all of that applies here as we talk about the relationships we cultivate towards social change.
Thank you so much. And I do want to acknowledge a related question that came in on relationship building, just because I think it's so important and common in philanthropy to have a nonprofit feel like there's a lot of overlap between their mission and then the mission of a foundation and what they say there was support, but then you get this big sign that says no unsolicited proposals, right? And so even when you have that personal connection, it's kind of hard. Feels like you're stepping over a line, this participant said, in trying to like make that first step or even approach that foundation or that individual. So I just want to end with some closing thoughts, maybe around that or around how you've moved conversations with board members. You've given some great specifics, and I think that this is the work, right? It's about the how. And so maybe just any final thoughts or reflections you have about how you get started on this journey, and what specific practices have worked for you all. John, how about you lead us
Sure, I
off?
can start. I mean, I do really, for anybody that's really interested in this work, I think for the nonprofit side, Amanda and Moira's perspective, really kind of, you know, you could really push the philanthropic sector in the way that it needs to go by really coming together and saying, this is our experience collectively with you, right? There isn't no Yelp for funders, right? That would make things a lot easier, right? But you have to collectively be able to approach, whether it's the industry of philanthropy in your respective communities or others, and be able to say, this is our experience. On the flip side, for philanthropy, the best way to start is to try to find honest, we have accountability partners that know that they can tell us anything and know that they can tell it and feel totally trusting that nothing is going to happen to their funding and we need that. And, we started that by mystery shopping, by having partners experience what it was like to apply and to get underneath that. That would be a good start to your journey, right? Really getting honest feedback from community about what it feels like to do this work, and what does community think about you, and what are the reasons for that. That not a listening tour. Communities hate that, right? But really getting your fingernails dirty and trying to understand how community experiences you. And then from there, designing a philanthropic approach that aligns to empowering community, really starting with the how. When nonprofit folks are having drinks at 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock, whenever they get off, when they're talking about philanthropy, they're complaining about the how. Of course, Amanda and Moira want more money, but what they're often talking about together is, man, did you see that process? Or this is the way I was treated, or this program officer, I can't believe they said this to me. That's what they're talking about. And so it's on us to really think through how we show up and find ways that we have honest brokers that can tell us how we show up, and then use that to fix our how.
Thanks, Brandi.
Yeah, I think all of those things. And I think for the previous question, I think about how do we think about our roles differently in philanthropy, and so that we're not sitting behind a desk and just waiting for grants to come in or waiting for people to reach out to us. What does it look like to be kind of going into the community to where nonprofits are, or making ourselves available? One thing that we tried to do is kind of this whole like coffee and conversations, where we were just going to be at a coffee shop in the community in the different neighborhoods across Alexandria and invite nonprofits to come have a conversation. Sometimes we sent out an article like, this is what we're reading. Come talk to us about what you think about it. Or just come if you're a new organization and you want to share what you're doing. We want to hear what's bubbling up for you. because I think there's this thing about how do we co-create together. That's what I love about trust-based relationships, is that we can't do everything on our own. And so what does it look like to say, okay, this is what you're working on, this is what I'm working on. When we come together, we can do so much more and so many more ideas. And then we start bringing in other people. I don't know, it's just more fun and it feels more human to be in relationship with people. And so, yeah, that would be my encouragement. And then just to like try something. I think for sometimes we just don't take enough risks because we're fearful of what is our board going to say? What if it doesn't work out that way? But I think it's like, what does it look like to try something new and see every moment as an opportunity to learn? And then I think then we as funders let's come back together and talk about some of the things that are working or not working, and invite the nonprofits if they feel comfortable talking to us too. But just like, how can we co-create something together so that we're all being better at the work that we're doing to create this ecosystem that is more just and a vibrant place for everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks, Moira.
Yeah, I think starting to have conversations with the folks who are already in your network and just sharing where you are at and where you are challenged. Because I think Amanda made the point earlier in talking about like this family foundation as an example. I think that people get excited when they feel like they have something to offer, right? And it can be so invaluable in your own learning to think about how you're doing something well and how you might do it differently. And so I think starting with that kind of, by first modeling it and inviting it and opening that door, then I think you're already kind of opening the door for potential reciprocity. And so, and trust building, right? And so I think being honest about where you're feeling challenged is a huge part of that trust, and not saying, oh, I'm not going to hit my youth served or whatever, but just, we're really struggling with recruitment right now. Are you seeing that from any of your other grantees? How are they, what have you seen from them that's been helpful? Or what thoughts do you have, right? Like whatever those challenges are, I think that there's something really important to be gleaned from that. And I think also, it's hard for me to know how much of this is just because I have an amazing executive director who's been with the organization for such a long time, but I think we're very fortunate in that we do have opportunities for open conversations with our grantors, and they may not all say, I am doing trust-based philanthropy, but I see that there's definitely trust in Wide Angle and what we do. And so when we are having a challenge, sharing that back to them has been enormously helpful, and doing that sooner rather than later has been quite helpful. And so I think that's just how you start, right? And it's not being afraid of not being perfect. It's okay. There's so much understanding out there. And I think that's just how you open the door to collaboration too.
Thank you. Amanda, any quick final thoughts?
I do have one thought. I want to echo the problem solving, like learning orientation Brandi's talking about, Moira's talking about collaboration. One thing we haven't really talked about is the way nonprofits interact with one another. And I actually think nonprofits do have a role with each other here. I think a lot of nonprofits often think about philanthropy as a pie that can't get bigger. And when we are confident in our unique role, we are better able to collaborate with like-minded organizations without feeling like I'm, stepping on their feet. Like we all want something similar. We're doing very different things, and we have this network of support that may be different. Why can't we bring this together? Why can't we share donors? Why do we? And so the literacy organizations in Alexandria have come together to start the Alexandria Literacy Initiative. And in February, I'm bringing my biggest donor to a meeting where we're going to talk about that donor's idea. I can't do it on my own. The collaborative can. Like, that's not very typical, but everybody is going to be better served by that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was such a privilege to be in conversation with all four of you. And we are at time, so I'm going to turn it over to Christine Nardi with the CNE. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brandi and Amanda and John and Moira and Holly. These were really amazing practitioner insights for all of us to advance our trust-based philanthropy work together. And I appreciate especially your practical examples, opportunities where you might stumble and learn and grow as we all put trust-based philanthropy into action. And I just noted a couple things that were highlights for me in the conversation. Moira talking about just getting started by sharing with funders where you are, what your needs are, where you're challenged, and asking if they've seen that with other nonprofits, and engaging in kind of a community of learning practice around that. John, the bedside manner audit and the mystery shopper, I think, are two things that we can all take away from today's conversation. Brandi, the question, how do we co-create together? And that it's actually more fun and more joyful if we're coming together, understanding that we all have assets to bring to the table, and they're different assets, but they're all needed in order to help our communities thrive. And then Amanda talking about that particularly, that we're partners that each bring assets to the table, and that what about if we all came together and talked about not just how we could seek collaborative funding, but how we could encourage funders to collaborate with all of us in a particular issue area. So I think those are really powerful ideas to continue to chew on. And we're going to be sharing some great to-go resources with the audience before we close today. But we wanted to close out with one particular question to put to our webinar audience, because what we like to do at CNE is always think about what's that one next step, what's the one next thing that we might be able to all do to move this forward a little bit. So I'm going to put that out to our webinar audience and invite you to answer in chat. What's one thing you're going to take away from today's session or try that helps you support trust-based philanthropy? And as we're waiting for maybe some ideas to come through the chat, I'd love to ask that of our panel as well. I know that when you do these sorts of things, you're bringing your expertise to the table around the ways that you're trying trust-based philanthropy, but I'm sure you've also learned some things too. So let me just go round robin. What's one thing that you'll take away from today's session, as we're seeing if any of our participants will put ideas in the chat? And I'll start with Amanda.
Sounds like
Sorry, Amanda.
It sounds like I need to be challenging my less trust-based relationships a little bit.
Great. Okay. How about Moira?
Yeah, I like this idea of this is a movement and we all have our part to play in advancing it. And so really thinking about how, what my part can be. And I have one task I have a piece of critical feedback for a funder that I have to send out this week. So I'll start there.
Thank you, Moira. Thanks for the courage and the bravery. Brandi.
Oh gosh, there's so many things. I was just thinking about our coffee and conversations, and we really need to restart those. So yes, so yeah, just being more available. I think trying to, it drives me crazy when I look at my schedule and there's no time on there so I have to make room. I think we all have to make room in our schedules to have just time to be available. So that way people, when they want to meet or have conversations, that we are free to do that.
Excellent. I look forward to seeing those pop up on your calendar. And John.
I love the coffee chats. We do a lot of like a coffee chat adjacent type of things, but nothing as seems as awesome as what Brandi is showing. So I might ask to see her notes on that. That's a really good addition to some of the community conversations we like to have.
Great. And I'm seeing some great examples come in. I love, Emily, thank you for that image of stop picturing a scary, slightly angry person on the other end of your grant applications. Thank you for that authenticity and focusing on conversation and problem solving together. And it looks like Dee Dee's talking about the acknowledgement of the imbalance of power in the relationship. It's quietly insidious and painfully patriarchal. And I want to take that quote and carry it with us, because that's truth. And that you'd like to see the foundations move away from that relationship with your grantees. The awareness of the power imbalance seems to be resonating, and more staff and board peer conversations around trust-based philanthropy, and stealing Brandi's coffee and conversation idea. Thanks, Holly. And go to one of Brandi's coffee chat. So Brandi, you've already got some people who are interested in showing up, needing to think more about how to move from the pitch to the conversation. Really appreciate that, thinking about the relational part of this work. So I love how everyone is already starting to think about what is that one next thing that you're going to be able to do to move your trust-based philanthropy practice forward, because it really is a practice. We're all practicing. And one of CNE's values is excellence, and the way that we just define excellence is learning and growth with humility. And I heard a lot of that in today's conversation. So thanks everybody for the responses, and we'll be sharing some of the responses for what's the one next step in our follow-up email. And before we share the promised resources to go, we'd greatly appreciate it if folks would take just a few minutes to complete our very brief feedback survey. You'll see a link in the chat, and that's going to help us continue to create relevant 7AP programming for you. And to encourage your continued exploration, we're going to post some resources to go in the chat, and also we will have a follow-up email that will thank our panelists, as well as including a recording for today and some of the resources that we're posting in the chat. First, our 7 actionable principles resources on the topic, and keep an eye out for further webinars and other ways to engage with the principles. And we also really want you to check out the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project's website for more great resources, including what nonprofits are saying about trust-based philanthropy and grant-making operations with a trust-based philanthropy lens. So thank you all again for a wonderful conversation today, and for all the next steps that we are all going to take individually and collectively on our trust-based philanthropy journeys. Have a good afternoon.